So welcome everybody. My name's Eric Meyer and I'm here with Robert Norton and also our room moderator Maria Fisk, and very much welcome you to this session on blockchain and a fair art market, which might be a little bit different than some of the other sessions you've been attending insofar as we're going to be talking about art more than we are about libraries and other information institutions, but hopefully there will be interesting connections that you'll be able to make and that we've certainly seen in the work. So I haven't been to all the sessions today, but I was at the keynote session earlier, and it was very nice of Jason Griffey to explain a lot of the basics of blockchain for us, so we don't have to do that again in our session. So I think the plan today is we're going to have, I'm going to present for 10 minutes, plus or minus a couple of minutes, and then Robert is going to present for a couple of minutes, plus or minus a couple, and then we'll have time for questions if you want to type those into the chat. Or, if there aren't questions forthcoming, Robert and I will have a chat with each other about some of the things that we're interested in that come up from each other's thoughts. So let me just jump right ahead. The recording has been started, and a recognition of the founding partner of this, the San Jose State University School of Information. So, starting off with myself, my name's, as I've said, Eric Meyer. I'm currently at the University of Oxford, where I'm a professor of social informatics, and I'm also a Turing Fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. That's only true until the end of July, when I'm moving to the iSchool at Austin, where I'm going to be the dean of the iSchool at the University of Texas at Austin starting August 1st. So you can see my contact details there are changing in August. If you can use the iSchool address already, the dean at ischool.utexas.edu, if you have questions for me afterwards. So blockchain and a fair art market, what do we mean by that? So this whole area of blockchain, as you've been hearing a lot about today, is gotten a lot of interest. I think the first presenter talked about this, Gartner hype cycle, that we're sort of at peak hype or maybe past peak hype and starting to get into the trough of disillusionment a bit, as Donald McKenzie would put it. But the question that comes up is, what do you do with this? And I'm going to talk a little bit today, very briefly, about a project that we've recently done, and I'll have a link on one of the later slides to the report that was just released a week or two ago about blockchain in the arts. And this project started probably nearly 2 years ago when Jelaine Tawandris, who's the CEO of an organization called Docs, which I'll talk a little bit more about, rang me up and she said, this thing blockchain, Eric, I need to understand it because people are trying to sell me things and I really need to know what is going on here. We need some proper research into what the possibilities of blockchain are, and particularly in the art market. So we started a project, and the idea was to get beyond this hype. So this slide is a 2012 picture of Bitcoin magazine. This is what people certainly at the time were thinking about with blockchain. It was always just anarchy and wildness out there in the wild west of Bitcoin. But the things that we're going to be talking about today are, I think, a little bit more to date than some of the wild Bitcoin claims about blockchain. Instead, look at how can blockchain and more generally distributed ledger technologies be used to solve some interesting problems in an important sector of the economy. So DAX, who sponsored this research along with the Alan Turing Institute that I'll talk about, is a British organization. The name originally stood for Design and Artist Copyright Society. Now it's just DAX. And they represent artists, particularly to make sure that working artists get the money and the royalties and the income that's due to them so that they can stay active as working artists. And you'll see as we go in the next couple slides, there's some interesting challenges to that when we talk about keeping track of the kinds of payments that are due to artists. So DAX has been representing artists for decades, and they help clear a lot of the payments that are coming to artists in the UK, both living artists and their estates. And when we look at the art market, it's something that people don't necessarily think about the economic impact of the art market. And I'm sure that Robert can talk more about this than I can because he's very tuned into the art market more generally. But essentially, we've got a huge art market that represents a significant part of the economy with millions and millions of dollars spent on it, but it largely flies under the radar. Now, the three problems that we were particularly interested in the art market are several, and the first is provenance of art. And of course, you've heard about this in some of the other talks, including in the keynote, about the possibilities of blockchain to be used to establish provenance and to check provenance. Now, when you're talking about provenance of published information, of course, this is the metadata, etc. With art, provenance is a key concern for art collectors, for artists themselves, and for everybody dealing in art, because you want to be sure that you're buying the art that you think you're buying. Obviously, we all have heard many of the stories of the horror stories of fraudulent art getting into the market, or the recent piece that was in the news about the museum that found that more than half of their artworks hanging on the walls were actually fraudulent copies rather than the original pieces that they thought they were. And so one of the questions is, to what extent can we use blockchain to record the creation of a piece of work of art and to track its provenance over time? And Verisart and Robert Norton will be talking about that in much more detail in a little bit. Another question is about payments. So one of the interesting things in Europe is this policy called artist resale right, which means that if you're an artist and you sell a piece of work, I sell a piece of work to Robert for $10,000 that I've created, or 10,000 euros. When that work gets resold, the artist actually has a legal right to some of that resale value when it gets sold again. And you can imagine that the difficulties in A, knowing that the sale happened, and B, getting that money to the artist are not insignificant. And so one of the questions we are asking in this research is, to what extent can we use a distributed ledger to track the fact of sales and also the amount of sales, so that those monies can be more readily flowed to the artists that are owed it. And this question of finances is important when an artist is alive, but in some ways becomes more complicated when the artist dies, and their estates can be extremely complicated. An artist who dies, their estate might be divided among heirs from different foundations, from different individuals. And so when they've got these money that's supposed to be flowing to their estate, how does that money flow around? And can we use blockchain to deal with some of those microtransactions or those fractional transactions? So we released this report about it, as I mentioned, on May 22nd in the House of Commons, and Robert was there. We all were there to release this report. And in this report, Duncan McDonald-Korth, who was the main researcher on this, laid out a plan for what we call Art Market 2.0, or the fair art market, how we might use blockchain to better help support artists, but also to deal with some of these other problems in the art market. Now, I don't have a lot of time, so what I want to just talk about is some of the key findings from Project Novum, which was the project that created this report, and then I'll encourage you to go off and read the report yourself. It's very readable. Duncan's a great writer, and it's a relatively short report, and you can download it from that link on the previous page at any time. So the several things I'd like to highlight is the fact that in the report we talked about the fact that blockchain is more than just a technology. It's really a discourse, and this is partly what you've been seeing today, that in a lot of places we are talking to people, blockchain is still being used by many, and I don't include Verisart in this because they've got real products, but by many who go around trying to talk about blockchain as a way of, it's a sales technique, saying we've got a blockchain solution for X when they don't actually have any technology behind it. It's simply to get investors interested. So that's one of the things that we have to move beyond, is this sort of hype around it, which is, I think, a number of speakers today have alluded to. Beyond that, the economic stakes involved in the introduction of DLTs in the art market is really high. The distributed ledgers can help with the trading of art, but also this whole idea of provenance tracking and tax collection related to art transactions is important, and also potentially hugely valuable to the artists. One of the things that sets DAX apart as an organization is that they are set up as a foundation that is designed to support the artists. It's not about making the most money for DAX, it's about getting the most money to artists so that artists can stay active. And the economic stakes for that are important, because how do we keep active artists in a country like the UK or elsewhere? Unless we can get those money to artists, they're not going to be able to succeed, and they're not going to be able to live as artists. Also, the question of whether we can speak for artists. One of the things that Duncan did in this project is talk to a lot of artists, and not all artists have the same opinion toward financialization of their art or monetizing art. Certainly, most artists didn't get into it for the idea of keeping track of their finances, which is why organizations that help them do that are important. But also, some of them were quite resistant to the idea that we should encourage financialization in the market, in the art sector, because they were doing it for They wanted to make their original sales of art, but also had some other interest beyond simply the financial aspects. One of the key points that Duncan makes in the report is the idea that art market liquidity and value are likely to soar if we can increase some of these possibilities of having transactions tracked through distributed ledgers. There's been an increase in art-based lending, partly because if we can financialize art pieces and be able to show what the value is, we can start lending against that and borrowing against that. And that has both promise, because you can borrow against the pieces of art hanging on a wall, but it also increases risk. This is some of the ways that the real estate market got into trouble in 2008, was by having a lot of lending against things that were previously not lent against. So the bottom line here is that we've proposed something we call the fair art market, and I'll just explain this briefly before I turn over to Robert, which is the idea that you could have something like fair trade. If you go and you buy a cup of coffee, and you can choose to buy a fair trade cup of coffee, which says there's a standard that's attached to it, and if I buy that fair trade cup of coffee, that the value is going back to the people who are growing it, not exploiting people. We're arguing for something similar in the art market. If we had something similar to a fair trade art market, a fair art market, that you could say, if I buy this piece of art and it's following these principles that we've laid out for following the fair art market, then I can feel good about the fact that I'm supporting artists, that the money is going back to artists and supporting the kinds of activities that I believe in are important in society. But also, I've got a social value of being able to say this art that I've got hanging on my wall and that I've got in my gallery has been traded fairly, and that I'm not exploiting people to get this benefit for myself. So I think that's one of the key things that we have coming out of this report. So I've taken my 10 minutes plus a minute or two. Here's my contact details, both at Oxford and at Texas starting in August. I'll be happy after Robert talks to take any questions. So let me now hand over to Robert, who's going to talk you through Verisart and the kinds of things that they bring to this whole setting of the art market. Robert?
Thank you so much, Eric. And yes, I was listening to your presentation, and in fact, I was one of those people that was trying to sell things to Ghislaine at DAX several years ago, and we're now partners with DAX. I'm an entrepreneur. I have founded a number of businesses in this intersection of art and technology, well-known companies such as Saatchi Art in the US. This is a platform for independent artists to sell their work directly to digital art platforms that are used by well-known artists such as Damien Hirst, Jenny Holzer, Bill Viola, and many others. I'm just going to share with you a little bit about how we apply blockchain technology to a specific application, which is the problem of certificates of authenticity and the inability to run real-time verification of provenance in paper certificate standards. So the art market, as Eric kind of pointed out, is bedeviled by fraudulent activity. These are some recent headlines in the last year. And fraud at any level harms an artist's reputation. And the estimated size of fraudulent activity in the art market is around $6 billion a year. And to put that in perspective, that is larger than the total amount of art sold online. So it's about 1/10 of the overall market. Now, why is this an issue? Because when you're buying and transacting online, you necessarily have to overcome a higher hurdle in terms of trust. We may remember the time when we first made our first e-commerce transactions online. We were nervous about putting our credit card into the computer, but we've largely kind of overcome that trust. When it comes to buying and selling arts and collectibles, there's still a great deal of reservation about whether or not what you're buying is authentic and whether or not the person who's selling it to you has the authority to sell it. The art market, I think, can be best described as both opaque and transparent. I've spent the last 10 years building tech businesses in the art market, and 20 years ago, I think we were much more on the left-hand side, lack of documentation, paper records, fragmentation of databases, information silos, and privacy being paramount. We've gone a long way in the last few years towards linked open data standards. We at Verisart use something called CDOC, which is CRM or an ontology for classifying cultural objects. We use structured vocabulary from Data Research Institute for when we make our statements of the objects that then get certified. We also use image recognition technology from Rutgers University from one of our board advisors, Professor Ahmed El-Gamal. But anyhow, we're moving undoubtedly towards more data being out there. What's interesting about the blockchain is that it is ultimately both opaque and transparent. And segueing here to some of the previous businesses that I've done. The really kind of important point here is that what we're trying to do is to fuse together the certificate of provenance in the registry through an underlying distributed ledger technology, which means that it's impossible to separate the certificate from the provenance or from the registry. And I'll explain how we do that just by giving you an example of how it works. So an artist makes a record. That record is recorded as a cryptographic hash. The hash is distributed when it's validated. It is attached to the artwork information, and then the artwork information can be appended and updated with subsequent hashes. We're not an authority at Verisart, and what you put into your record is up to you. So some people will hash a multispectral image if it's an old master's painting. Some people may, in fact, have a certain unique fingerprint or inventory number or seal. So our digital certificates support further authentication points as a user may wish. We differentiate in our system between known issuers or verified issuers that have the authority to create certificates of authenticity, so that's suggested here by the artist, and then unknown issuers that are just creating certificates of record. So one of our artists is Shepard Ferry. He's a participating artist in Verisart, uses it for his fine artwork. On the left is a paper certificate. On the right is now one of his digital certificates. They're pretty similar in terms of the description of the work, except there's a few extra things. You can see a timestamp in the top right-hand side. You can see something called under current owner, which is fifth item down, the public key, a URL, a blockchain address. And this is another example of a partner, Avant Artists, or limited edition prints, customizing a record, using it for their unique certification of prints that they sell on their website. DAX is a partner of us as well, so we recently launched something called Bronze Chain, which allows bronze foundries to create unique certification of works that come out of their foundries. This is the DAX Bronze Chain certificate that we launched a few months ago. And we're now integrating into arts management systems in the US. This is one of the largest called Art Systems, because wherever the user doesn't have to duplicate data entry, the better. And you can read about us on verisart.com, been in the news lately. There's some really interesting things that we're working on with regards to unique fingerprints that only a computer can see from the capture of an image. And I'll just kind of leave you before we open up to questions of this book that came out earlier this year called The Scientist and the Forger, and there was a chapter on the application of blockchain into the art world, and it ends by saying, the certificate benefits collectors who virtualize their assets without having to reveal to all price and identity. It benefits artists who gain a free inventory management system and galleries who inform when an artwork changes owner. Such system will enable users to verify a work's authenticity, condition, and provenance from their mobile phones before engaging in any online auction or sale. There is no doubt in the very near future blockchain technology will revolutionize the art world. And this is where it does come back to the question more of discourse as much as technology, and how soon that is, we are still to find out. But it's clearly having its moment this year. If you'd like to try out our platform, there's an invite code here called Leaders, and you're welcome to make a certificate and experience it for yourself. And now look forward to opening it up for questions.
So I noticed we have one question down there already about DRM for musicians. know very much about that. Do you have any thoughts about that, Robert?
The question is using blockchain for musicians.
So if you look down the chat box, Chuck has asked a question about how blockchain might impact DRM for musicians who no longer earn money from their recordings as they used to.
Right. There is a company called Mycelium that Imogen Heap has been involved in, and I think there are a few other companies that are looking to track music or artist copyright, recording artist copyright, publishing rights. There was a company that Spotify bought about a year and a half ago called Media Chain, and it's not my industry. I've never worked in the music industry, so I can't talk too much about it, but those are the two businesses that I can point to for further research.
Yeah, it's not an area that I've got tons of information about either. I do think that one of the interesting things about the arts that might be different than, say, Bitcoin, one of the challenges people talk about with blockchain is the fact that the transaction limits that are built into the Bitcoin and the whole mining thing. Largely, I think if we're talking about the art market, it doesn't need to operate at quite the same speed as, say, credit card clearances do. I mean, do you have any thoughts about that, Robert, in terms of scalability and how you're dealing with scalability in your particular applications?
We had a real experience of it last year as the price of Bitcoin was rising so fast because we were paying every certificate had a Bitcoin transaction. And even though we were paying just a fraction of the money in order to have the transaction on the blockchain, there was still the miners fees, which became incrementally more expensive. And it became actually prohibitive for us to continue to put certificates onto the blockchain that way. But there are other ways that you can batch data to lessen your exposure against having to deal with transactions on a one-to-one level. One can look at transactions on a many-to-one level and still have the same level of cryptographic security. So I think that there's a lot of innovation in that area. We use something called open timestamps, which one of our board advisors, Peter Todd's code, and so we timestamp our data and then we batch it and record that on the blockchain in one hash.
Okay. I see another question from Sue Scott that definitely is up your alley, Robert. How is provenance verified for physical artifacts?
So it's much easier when the work is coming onto the market for the first time because you have kind of like the Big Bang effect where the artist is releasing work for the first time and they're creating unique certification for that work. It's more difficult when the work is existing in a secondary market, i.e. it's kind of already been out there, because the question is who is the authority at that point to create the trusted record. We look at our platform as a evidentiary and endorsable record. So it's not that you're seeing just a certificate on its own. You're seeing a certificate in terms of how many timestamps, how long is the chain of information on that record, how many contributors potentially have added data to the record. Maybe some contributors like insurers or shippers might be known authorities, and also how much physical data is on a record. So this can give people a sense of a record being more used or trusted within the system. But it's not our current focus to go after secondary market works. It's much easier for us to work with artists or e-commerce platforms that are issuing works to the market for the first time.
And one of the things that, that she says digital native work primarily then.
It's not so much as digital native work, it is physical work. So
yeah.
It's just that it's physical work that is being certified for the first time. So let me give you an example. So I'm Shepard Fairey, and I've created 100 editions of prints that I'm selling, and now I've created unique certification for each print. To some extent, I don't worry as much about unauthorized reproductions of my work, because I'm telling my audience that these certificates are the sole certificates for the print. And the way that the Bitcoin blockchain works is there's an anti-double spend provision that prevents me from spending the same Bitcoin twice, and that's similar to the same certificate being distributed more than once. So there are protections by using the distributed ledger technology that allow these certificates to be unique, secure records, and that means that there's much less value in an unauthorized reproduction, because unless that unauthorized reproduction has an authorized certificate, it's going to be of questionable value, not of real value.
Yeah, well, and I think that ties into the whole idea that we were raising about some sort of certification that makes people trust what's going on in the art market. And I think companies like Verisart play an important role in that. I think we've only got about a minute left. Anything you want to say to wrap up, Robert?
I had a question for you, actually, which is, I think this fair trade art concept is incredibly exciting and interesting. But from a practical point of view, does that mean that the artist would retain the title, and in the subsequent sale, their interest in the title would kind of serve as a lien on the future artwork sale? Is there any kind of legal mechanism in order to enable this type of structure?
Potentially. I'm not a lawyer, but I think that's partly what we had in mind, is how can you sort of establish not just the moral right, but the legal right for people to retain this interest in their art. And I think that's, it requires some changes in various parts of the economy, not just in the art market itself, but also in the legal system surrounding it. But I think there's real potential there. And if we can use this to let people feel good about the art they're buying, but also better support the artists, it's a win-win for nearly everybody except for the bad actors and the art forgers and people like that. So I don't feel bad about them losing out.
Yeah, it's a super interesting idea, and one that I'd like to explore further.
Yeah, and Dax is going to be taking that forward with my co-author, Duncan McDonald-Korth, so that'll be something to watch for. So I think we're about out of time. Looks like it's 10:30 in the UK, whatever time it is, wherever people are. So thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Robert. I enjoyed this, and I think everyone now, I think if we go to the final slide, it tells everyone to leave the room, and then when everybody's gone, we turn it off and the recording gets made. So
yep, I'll take care of that. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Eric and Robert, for bringing all these interesting points to our attention. I've put a link to the closing session down below, if anyone, so people can switch to the next session.
All right, thank you so much.